Good morning, folks. Come on in. Good morning. My name is Jim Ludis. I am Vice President for Strategic Initiatives at Salve, Regina University, Executive Director of the university's Pell Center. And it's my distinct pleasure to welcome all of you here today. You didn't come to hear me, though. You came to hear from Colin Woodard. And I first met Colin a couple of years ago. I hosted a show on PBS called Story in the Public Square, and we featured his book, Union, which, if you haven't read it, is, I think, one of the most thoughtful examinations of the story of America from its founding up into the first half of the 20th century. And as we finished that interview, I literally said to Colin, "What are you going to do with this work, Colin?" He said, "Well, it's funny. I'm trying to figure out what's next." And so for the last 2 years at the Pell Center, he has worked, he's created the Nationhood Lab. He has worked to develop an idea into something real, something tangible. And that's why we're here today. So I think everybody in the room probably knows Colin. You know that he is a best-selling author. He's a journalist who has worked both domestically and internationally. And he is, for someone who's only been in the academy for 2 years, one of the most prolific scholars I know. I had to ask him when he came in this morning. He's got 21 peer-reviewed articles in that first 2 years as an academic. There are people who do their entire careers and they don't get 21 published peer-reviewed studies. So he's a force of nature. He's why we're here today. So let me bring him up and we'll do some justice. Ladies and gentlemen, Colin Woodard.
Great. Well, thank you, and thank you all for coming today, and for those who are joining us on the live stream. As Jim mentioned, I'm Colin Woodard, and I run Nationhood Lab, where I study and write about the problems of United States nationhood, how to solve for them, and how to defend the liberal democratic experiment in the face of resurgent authoritarian ethno-nationalism. Unfortunately, our work has become increasingly relevant with each passing month. Americans are no longer standing at the edge of an abyss, as I've been saying for years. We've dove right in, and nothing is going to be the same in our lifetimes. We're also going to learn if we are capable of standing up for our founding ideals, of fighting for our freedom, now that it must again be fought for. I know we can do it. The question is if we will. Now, people sometimes say, well, this isn't who we are. Well, it's not who we should be, but it's very much who we've been at various junctures in our past. In this context this morning, I want to share 3 things with you, which I think are vital if America is to survive both as an idea and as a single federation. First, briefly, on how we got here, an explanation for why the United States, despite its myriad advantages, is, and for much of its existence has, been divided against itself, and thus vulnerable to collapse. Secondly, to explain the vital importance of having a story of common purpose, and of that story being built on the most consequential ideals to come out of our founding, a story that can help hold us together against the forces of autocracy that threaten to bring down our republic and shatter the Federation. Finally, and most importantly, to share the results of our year-long initiative at Nationhood Lab to develop, test, and share just such a story for 21st century Americans. Now, I'll discuss more on that latter point in just a few minutes, but to really understand the existential importance of having a rebooted national narrative, I want to start with what I hope will be some helpful deep background information on the fundamental characteristics of the U.S. Federation, characteristics that have made this country more structurally vulnerable than many of its liberal democratic peers. Here is an essential and often overlooked fact of our national experience. The United States is not a nation state, and it never has been. We're a collection of stateless nations, each with their own intense ideals and stories of national purpose. These regional cultures, which don't respect state or even international boundaries, have never been in agreement on the big questions. What's the proper role of government? What's the proper relationship between church and state? And even the meaning of such keywords in the American democratic lexicon as freedom or liberty. These stateless nations, these regional cultures, go back to the beginning of European conquest and settlement, to the 17th and early 18th centuries. The original clusters of colonies were settled by people from distinct regions of the British Isles and from the Netherlands and France and Spain, each with their own religious, political, and ethnographic characteristics. Each was first colonized at a separate time and under a different political model. Some of these championed individualism, others utopian social reform. Some embraced an explicit Anglo-Protestant identity, others ethnic and religious pluralism. Some valued equality and democratic participation, others deference to an aristocratic order modeled on the slave states of classical antiquity. The Puritan project in New England had little in common with the neo-feudal aristocratic society of the Chesapeake country, or with a Dutch commercial colony encompassing what's now Greater New York City, or New Spain's far-flung northern frontier, or the West Indies Slave Society planted in the deep southern lowlands by English planters from Barbados. For generations, these discrete Euro-American cultures developed in remarkable isolation from one another, consolidating their own cherished principles and fundamental values, and spreading across the eastern half of the continent in nearly exclusive settlement bands. They saw themselves as competitors for land, for settlers, for capital, and even as enemies, taking opposing sides in the English Civil War of the 1640s, in the Glorious Revolution of 1688 and here 1689, in the American Revolution, in the War of 1812, and of course in the US Civil War. Here, by the way, is a map of the Spanish colonization of the Southwest. The areas shaded are the areas actually colonized, boots on the ground, prior to the US annexations. But the point is that there's never been an America, but rather several Americas. And there are 11 today. To see their effect, you have to see it at a county level, because again, the settlement streams didn't respect state boundaries in many cases. Now, there isn't time to describe them to you here now in this context, but suffice to say that they have always been divided on the key issues with profound effects on American history and society. At Nationhood Lab, we study these effects, which dramatically influence most aspects of 21st century American life, from elections to gun control, from politics and public opinion on abortion, climate change, and immigration, to the stark and significant regional divides in life expectancy, COVID-19 pandemic deaths, social vulnerability, household creditworthiness, per capita rates for diabetes, obesity, disabilities, arthritis, stroke, preventable dental problems, gaps that persist or even grow wider if you parse the data by wealth, race, education levels, urbanity, and other factors. We have a wealth of original data and analysis on these divides at nationhoodlab.org, and within 21 peer-reviewed academic papers I've co-authored on these topics over as many months. But for today's purposes, the point is that regional divides are real, they're persistent, and they matter for democracy and much else besides. So that brings us to the second issue. What holds us together? What's ever held us together? Because the regional cultures, those 6 eastern ones you saw on the eastern seaboard anyway, wound up together in an accident of history. They came together in 1775 to 1776 to fend off a common threat, a change in British imperial policy which threatened to destroy the relative autonomy of each of their individual political and social systems. And miraculously, this ragtag band of rebels won and found themselves inside something called the United States. But nobody really knew for sure what that was. In other words, the United States of America came into being as a contractual agreement, a means to an end for the parties involved. Nobody thought that they had created a nation state in the sense that Holland or Prussia or post-revolutionary France were. Its people lacked a shared history, religion, or ethnicity. They didn't speak a unique language all their own. They hadn't occupied the continent long enough to have a sense of dwelling in a mythic homeland since time immemorial, and they'd killed or pushed out, or were still pushing out, the very people who could make such a claim. They lacked a shared political heritage, apart from the imperial ties they had just rebelled against. In short, they had none of the foundations and building blocks of a nation state. They had no story to bring and hold themselves together. Now, such stories are required of every nation, be it Germany or Hungary or Japan or ourselves. Because think about it, as individuals, to have fealty to something as abstract as a nation, to feel that we owe it greater loyalty than to others, that we're somehow bound to its fellow members more than we are bound to other people who are not, that we might ultimately give our lives for it, that requires a compelling and credible story, an idea that's evocative and feels true on some level, that has footings in the past and gives us an answer for why we're together. A society without such a credible story, the historian William McNeill wrote 43 years ago, soon finds itself in deep trouble, for in the absence of believable myths, coherent public action becomes very difficult to improvise or to sustain. Our national story had to be created ex post facto, decades later, starting in the 1830s, really, a story I told in my most recent book, Union, the one that Jim and I made our acquaintance through. And it's the one thing that's held us together, more or less, ever since. But it's been contested from the outset. That story said, yes, we may lack a shared history, religion, or ethnicity, but what we share are a set of ideals, the ones from the famous passages in our opening statement as a people, the Declaration of Independence, the inherent equality of humans, their rights to life and liberty, and the pursuit of happiness and representative self-government. To be an American is to be committed to this set of propositions about the nature of the universe. Now, these are good ideals, a natural right granted to all humans by God or nature to survive, to not be tyrannized, to pursue our happiness as we each understand it, and to have equal access to the representative self-government that makes it all possible. And that we're in a covenant as Americans to protect one another's rights to these things. These are the ideals that Frederick Douglass fought for in every speech he gave. This is Lincoln at Gettysburg and Martin Luther King at the Mall. It's our civic national ideal, the American promise. But those ideals were contested immediately from the 1830s onward by a counter-narrative, first crafted by a group of Southern intellectuals who said, no, the Declaration is wrong. Humans are not equal. Only the Anglo-Saxon race, they argued, had the genius and ability to secure the promises in the Declaration. We're a classical republic, they argued, like ancient Greece and Rome, places where a minority have the liberty or privilege to practice democracy, and subjugation and slavery are the natural lot of the many. It was an ethno-national and inherently authoritarian vision. The battle between these two visions of America has been our eternal struggle. This was the fight throughout the antebellum period, and in the Civil War, and Reconstruction. The ethno-nationalists actually ruled this country federation-wide in a consensus of the 1910s and 1920s, when the first deep Southern president, Woodrow Wilson, segregated the federal government. When they were putting up the Confederate statues, which we were until recently tearing down. When Birth of a Nation was all the rage, celebrating the KKK's successful terrorist campaign to restore white supremacy in the occupied South. When the 1924 Immigration Act imposed racial quotas to defend the Anglo-Saxon character of the country. The civic national narrative didn't win the argument and become the federation-wide consensus until the 1960s, when the civil rights movement toppled Southern apartheid and challenged Northern racism. When the feminist movement demanded social, professional, and sexual equality for a gender that comprised a majority of the population. When gays and lesbians fought the police and discriminatory ordinances. An era when elite colleges began partially dismantling their old boys networks and public universities rapidly expanded to increase educational opportunities. Congress passed a new Immigration Act in 1965 that repealed the ethno-national quotas, reopening America's gates to humanity at large. A new generation of historians challenged the neo-Confederate narrative of American history that had dominated scholastic textbooks by that time for half a century, while dispelling the innocence of the American colonization of a continent. And that's when we became a liberal democracy, small l, small d. Not in the 1860s, but in the 1960s. It's in living memory. It's not inevitable. It's an incredible gift that had to be fought for and continues to be fought for. Because the forces of autocracy and ethno-nationalism are ascendant, and they have their narrative, their story of the kind of country they're fighting for, all worked out. Make America great again, like it was before that civic national triumph. The rest of America doesn't have their story worked out, and that's most of us. The 70 to 80% of Americans who polls repeatedly show don't actually want to live in that ethno-national authoritarian world. We, that 70, 80%, have lost our story, our message. We, that latent, transpartisan, pro-democracy supermajority. Americans were never great at talking about what our civic ideals mean in practice, but we stopped even trying after the Cold War, and a vacuum opened up, and demagogues stepped right in, as they always do. We need that story now. And that's the work that we've been doing at Nationhood Lab, the testing, polling, and crafting of an emotive, effective American story, one that can be used in ordinary conversations in real-world situations, one that recenters and revitalizes what should have been America's story for all of these past 249 years. And we're here now to share the results of that work. We met, and here on the eve of the semi-quincentennial, a hard word to say, which is the 250th birthday of this country, yes, but also of the Declaration and the unique peoplehood it aspired to create. Now, when this work got underway in earnest just less than a year ago, we met an unexpected and very happy surprise. This effort is aided by the fact that the story of national purpose falls on a sympathetic audience. In our preliminary national baseline poll, completed last April, we asked registered voters which statements about the nature of the United States they most agreed with. We offered statement pairs about our national purpose, about American identity, about the meaning of our past. In each case, one of the statements was keyed off the ideals in the Declaration. The other was rooted in more intrinsic characteristics, like ancestry, heritage, character, and values. The civic ones proved far more attractive regardless of gender, age, race, education, or indeed regional origins. 63% of Americans preferred the statement that we're united not by a shared religion or ancestry or history, but by our shared commitment to a set of American founding ideals, that we all have inherent and equal rights to live, to not be tyrannized, and to pursue happiness as we each understand it, over one embraced by only 33% of respondents that said we are united by shared history, traditions, and values, and by our fortitude and character as Americans, a people who value hard work, individual responsibility, and national loyalty. Now, I've put some of the crosstabs up from that poll here. Green is preference for the civic vision, yellow for the heritage and ethno-nationalist adjacent constructions. The former was the overwhelming favorite for most everyone, with two major exceptions, Republicans and those who voted for Trump in 2020. But still, 45% of those respondents in both those segments preferred the Declaration, joining 63% of independents and 79% of self-identified Democrats. And a lot of people say, well, those two segments are half the country. No, those two segments are roughly 28%. They're both overlapping. They're about 28% of eligible voters. And almost half of them prefer the civic version. 56% of respondents said they agreed more with the statement that Americans are duty-bound to defend one another's inherent rights and have a shared commitment to building a more free, just, and equal nation, over one that said we are duty-bound to defend our culture, interests, and way of life, and are committed to building a more free, prosperous, and secure nation, which was preferred by 36% of the survey respondents. As a starting point, before we'd even tried to work any messaging magic, these were very encouraging and unexpected numbers. Americans were clearly open to a national narrative based on the Declaration's values. But maybe they had other ideas, or actually disagreed with one another over its central propositions. To explore this factor, we had our pollsters conduct in-depth interviews with dozens of representative respondents from our polls. Our strategy was to start each conversation with some open-ended questions to warm you up about what they thought the country's purpose was, who could potentially belong, and what, if any, beliefs one should have to become an American. And after that, we would dive into our detailed questions about the Declaration's assertions. But to our surprise, respondents from wildly different backgrounds, age, education, gender, race, region, class, and partisan orientation, in the opening warm-up questions just started referencing the Declaration's values unprompted when asked those vague questions about what makes someone an American or what Americans' purpose is. The Declaration of Independence says our purpose of our government is to secure your rights, is what a Republican man in his late 30s in a lower management position in Greater Appalachia said when asked that opening question, what's the United States' purpose? We have a government that's supposed to acknowledge our inalienable rights versus other countries that don't have that. So today, we have a lot more freedoms than a lot of other countries do, he said. A 53-year-old indigenous American in the Midlands who identifies as an independent answered, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I'd say that's probably our purpose, to live here, to believe what you want, to worship, to love who you want to love, and to be left alone as long as you're not busting on anybody else, she said. Many Americans, we realized, really are hardwired with these values from that most sacred of our secular texts in a way that we had not anticipated. In late August, we completed additional rounds of polling, and one of the things we did, we tested, hey, do Americans really do agree with that argument that we are duty-bound as Americans to protect one another's natural rights to life and liberty and all the rest? And they do, by a shocking 97-2 margin. One of the widest our pollster had ever seen asking any question of anybody. You can't get that margin on whether the earth is flat or not, right? Americans value our democracy, but they need leadership and direction and a sense they're not alone, that they're in this together, that even in this darkening hour, the light of the American promise still burns. So we worked to optimize our messaging and tested various alternative language in 2 final national polls, one of 2,500 Americans, another of 1,000 respondents to the civic nonprofit More in Common's Hidden Tribes Project, which segments the electorate through values-based and moral foundations-based theory criteria rather than conventional demographics, often to great and revealing effect. One thing we wanted to know in all this is, should we develop custom narratives that would better resonate with particular segments of the American population, perhaps based on region, or race, or gender, or age, or education, or ideology, or some combination of those? But we found, with one partial exception, that the answer was no. Americans, by and large, are on the same page, at least for the 70 to 80% who don't embrace authoritarian ethno-nationalism. Not wishing to reinvent the wheel, we also made use of the messaging findings of others, including Issue 1, More in Common, and PACE, the Philanthropy for Active Civic Engagement, in regards to terms and words that do or do not resonate with the public. We tapped on the advice, and in some cases scholarship, of members of our advisory council, and we owe a debt to Harvard scholar Danielle Allen, whose line-by-line analysis of the Declaration in her 2014 book, Our Declaration, is an invaluable resource to anyone seeking to understand our founding ideals. And in the end, we devised what messaging people call a core narrative frame. This isn't meant for rote repetition, but as a guide for both long-form talking points and also a source from which to break out shorter components for use in, say, a social media post or a television soundbite, or just to inform your own conversations. And it goes like this. We're a nation defined not by shared bloodlines, religion, or history, but by a commitment to a set of ideals, the world-changing propositions about the inherent rights of humans set forth in our opening statement as a people, the Declaration of Independence. That every one of us has a set of intrinsic rights given to them by the universe or God, or as the Declaration puts it, nature's God, to survive, to live safe in their own person, free from domination, to live the life they choose for themselves, and to take part in determining who represents us and in holding them accountable. And that we, as Americans, are in a covenant to defend one another's natural rights to these things. That's the American promise, our mutual pledge to uphold these inalienable rights. And the American experiment is the effort, despite the despotic track record of human history, to build a nation, a society, a world where that is possible. We're a people united by our commitment to uphold and defend this experiment, lest it perish from the earth. These are the ideals Frederick Douglass fought for in every speech he gave. This is Lincoln at Gettysburg and Martin Luther King Jr. on the Mall. They're the ideals we've spent 250 years struggling to achieve, ideals contested from the outset by those who would make our country something far less, just another nation state built on blood, tribal kinship, inherited rule, inherited slavery, or inherited servitude, where rights are things granted by superiors when they are granted at all. Americans fought a civil war over them at home and a world war for them abroad and advanced them at Seneca Falls, Selma, and Stonewall. They're ideals each generation must fight for and that we fight for today. We reckon with our shortcomings, take pride in our advances, and pledge ourselves to make the Union more perfect. In the report, you'll find one variant for use with entirely conservative audiences. It has some small language changes, mostly in the realm of aesthetics, but the most consequential being in response to respondent preferences to downplay domestic equality struggles and to instead emphasize ones where the enemy was external, such as at Valley Forge or Normandy. You can see that annotated in the report that we've released today in the second narrative. Americans have plenty to debate legitimately in politics, like how best to execute the American experiment. Do you emphasize individual liberty or the common good, the building of a free community? But if America is to continue, if the Republic is to survive in the near term and the Federation over the longer run, we need to reaffirm what we have in common, a dedication to this set of sacred ideals. Finally, you might ask, what's next? Well, our goal would be to hack into the zeitgeist of this union of 340 million people, to seed these language and values into the national conversation and consciousness. To do that, however, is a shared endeavor, a voluntary effort by individuals and organizations, from journalists and opinion writers to artists and creators to political and intellectual leaders, from members of the state-level 250th anniversary commissions to those working in efforts to revitalize our civic education, to engage corporate and business leaders, to rescue our values-based transatlantic and trans-Pacific alliances, to ensure the integrity of our election systems, and to uphold the rule of law. To Americans of all walks of life out there who want the American experiment in liberal democracy to succeed. So with that, I invite you to take part, to connect with us, and to make use of and follow our work as it continues to unfold at nationhoodlab.org. A project, I should add, is citizen-powered and funded entirely by charitable donations. And I look forward to answering your questions. Thank you very much.
So we're gonna have a little colloquy here, to borrow from my time in the Senate. But we really want to take questions from the audience. So if you've got questions, raise your hand. We'll work you in. I get to talk to him all the time, and this is old hat for me. But Colin, so I think that the first question that leaps to mind. We spent 2 years telling people that you were going to improve on the language of the Declaration, only to find that the language of the Declaration actually is just fine. What is it that's distinctive about the messaging that you're recommending here today that you think has the potential to penetrate into the public's consciousness the way you mentioned at the end?
Yeah, I mean, one thing that we thought going into it when we were actually testing to optimize language, like, do you find this more compelling or this version of things? And a lot of it we thought would be an exercise in decoding and translating the archaic language in the Declaration, which you heard in our final version an awful lot, and decoding it into ordinary everyday language. And we tried that in some cases, yeah, that was true, but to a surprising degree, people prefer the powerful, if archaic, language in the Declaration because it has almost a sacred power, like you're quoting scripture, right? If you translate that into this common language, it doesn't have the same oomph, as long as what is being said is actually intelligible and understood by audiences today. So that's why, to a surprising degree, it sounds lofty, as people actually responded to its loftiness. And I think you have to capture the power of that. The Declaration and the Gettysburg Address have an impact in the American psyche that is very powerful in accordance with these ideals and that one should make use of with, discretion. Always making sure that people understand what you're talking about when you use it. But most people actually do.
So one of the things that I know that you've encountered in your travels and in your speaking engagements around the country is, I want to call it a reasonable skepticism that people say, yes, all well and good. People tell you on opinion surveys that this is what they believe, but will they actually act when others' individual rights are actually at stake?
Yeah, we wanted to stress test that a bit. I mean, it's one thing for people to say, yeah, 97% of us say that we are committed to one another's rights, but does that work out in practice? So we did, in that same poll, stress test that in different situations where the propositions in the Declaration are clearly being violated. And we chose a bunch that had actually happened somewhere in the country. Maybe the respondents would know that or not, but we didn't just make them up. And it was a mixed case, generally encouraging, but work to do for sure. Essentially we asked okay, how would you feel members of your own party control your local government and have decided to punish and threaten your local public libraries because they're refusing to withdraw book titles that some in your community feel have material they don't like or are hazardous. And people across the board, all parties were like, that's terrible, we shouldn't allow that to happen. Another question was, hey, you have an election in your area and members of your party control the government in your area, but they've lost the election. And although there's no evidence of fraud, they want to mess around with the election results basically so that they stay in power. Would you support that or not? No, no way, everyone says, regardless of party. But then there were a couple other questions where, in retrospect, as we looked at it, it had a more clear, in the context for most people, partisan advantage or disadvantage. Like we asked the question about, the Supreme Court says that presidents are above the law. Do you think that presidents should be above the law and can't be enforced for criminal acts? And then suddenly you saw on the Republican side a huge switch away with people saying, not agreeing with the Supreme Court's decision. I mean, the case was Trump versus United States, so even though it applies to a Democratic president in theory, you could see the slide off there. Another question about early voter registration. Your community has had early voter registration, and there's no sign of fraud, but members of your party want to change that because it advantages your opponents and gets more of them out to the polls, and that's the reason. And Republicans were in support of that. Now, what we don't know is, because the questions we chose were real-world examples, we didn't have any examples where the coding in retrospect would have been a Democratic advantage. So we don't really know if the Democrats would start sliding off, but we do know that people start sliding off if they read it as a tribal marker. But if they read it just in principle, they're totally against it. So somewhere in there is where, there's work to be done, obviously, and then somewhere in there is where it's going to take place.
You present some of this data in the report that, if folks didn't get it on the way in, it's at the table at the front, but it's also available online at both nationhoodlab.org and pellcenter.org, and at Nationhood Lab, you've got a ton of data. All of the data that this is based on is there for folks to look at their own leisure.
Correct, and in some cases in more detail than the sort of 12-ish page report that we've handed out today. That's kind of executive summary level. If you dive into Nationhood Lab, you'll find sometimes crosstabs and poll results and things out there to delve into this in more detail.
What do you say, and folks, if you've got questions, just raise your hand and I'll call on you. What do you say to those who, perhaps not uncharitably, view the United States as already failed, and irredeemably so?
Yeah, that's often the first question I get when I'm talking to people either in meetings or to audiences, is that question, right? Haven't we all failed? We haven't upheld the ideals. America's, depraved and unsalvageable in that regard. But when you stop and ask people, they're always, and we found this in the formal polling and qualitative interviews, they're upset. They don't dislike the ideals. They're upset that America's not upholding those ideals. On the left, on the progressive side, it's usually that the failures that we've had in the past, especially slavery and the Southern race-based caste system. On the right, it's the feeling that the administrative state's growth has sapped away and is controlling and confining human freedom and ability to operate. But in both cases, their anger is based on these ideals that we're arguing are central to the American experiment being violated. I think ditto for when you see those polls where young people don't like democracy anymore. Young people don't like the status quo of government, which isn't serving people well. I think everyone's concerned about the general direction of government in this country. If it's called a democracy, they're voting against that. And so I think the actual, especially when you have the conversations, as we did in the qualitative interviews, once you've acknowledged that we are not achieving those ideals, they're all with you on the idea that that's what we should be doing and to go for it. But you've got to acknowledge that this is not something that we've accomplished. It's aspirational, and there's a fight to do it.
We have a couple, bless you all. So we're going to start here. I'm going to repeat the question just because we've got folks watching online. So Jonathan, why don't you just get started?
The Trump administration has certainly been very active in its first 6-7 weeks. And you could perhaps argue that there's a contest of rights going on in terms of freedom from the administrative state that you just referred to, versus protection of various kinds of rights. There have been over 100 class action or suits for injunctive relief that have already been filed, tracked on the Just Security Litigation Tracker, which list a whole lot of constitutional provisions as well as statutory provisions that have been allegedly violated. Can you talk about that contest of rights as it's playing out in the first couple of months of the Trump administration?
Yeah.
How you see it and where you think it might head?
I mean, there's a legitimate and standing conversation going decades and even centuries back in the American story about how do you execute the American experiment, by maximizing the autonomy of the individual and protecting that individual liberty, or by building cultivating a Republican citizenry and building a free community, and the theory being that you need to create the infrastructure that makes it possible for humans to be, as individuals, to be free. Those are two competing traditions. It's a legitimate fight, and that's been the story up until about 2016. That's been the story of our politics. We usually have a more individualistic and a more communitarian party. Sometimes the parties flip on that over the decades, but that's been the basic conversation. What's happened in the first few weeks of the current administration that's so alarming is that it's the violations of the Constitution, Article 1, and basic rule of law that are taking place. That's the concern, which is all not in accordance with the Declaration's values or the Constitution. And when you're in a system where a authoritarian regime is consolidating, the point is to break all the constraints on its authority. It's done, who's going to stop you? So that's the concern I would have now, isn't between administrative state and that, but that we're living in a situation that's becoming post or extra constitutional.
Sir, we'll get to all of you. Right here.
That's good to see
Sure.
you. One of the things that's been most compelling to me about your work since we first discovered it is this idea that you can see the lingering traces of these original nations in statistical demographic data, county by county, in the contemporary world.
Yeah.
I'm curious, do you see also the pervasive or lingering narratives of those original nations capture resonance in kind of a corresponding way relative to kind of the collective national narrative? And if so, what are some of those competing stories?
That's a great question.
Repeat that question for folks at home.
So for those of you out there, the question is, if you have these different regional cultures, these regional cultures have their own stories, presumably, of their own mythos and belonging, which they may extrapolate for the United States as a whole, and does that affect our national conversation, the history wars and so on? And the answer is yes. And fortunately, I just turned in a book. It comes out November 4th. Nations Apart, How America's Regional Cultures Shattered the Union, something like that. You can find it out there. Viking has a page. There's not a cover up yet. But there's an entire chapter I researched asking exactly that question, which I hadn't asked before in that detail. Do these regional cultures have their own mythos? And I'm trained as a historian, so I'm looking at it from a historian's perspective. And the answer is yes, a number of them have their own stories. For instance, the story, the American dream story, which is not the same as what we've been talking about here. That's the notion that America's purpose is that people can come here, and if they work hard and play by the rules, they can elevate their material state of being and become anything they want to be. That is a Dutch and New Netherlander phenomenon. Even the Horatio Algio stories and all those things took place and were written in New York City in that context. The Dutch in the 17th century had created a society where a self-made person could exist. Many of the people who emerged in the aristocracy, the Schuylers from Hamilton and all those people, started as nothing. They were soldiers, a few generations before. That was not how the world generally worked at that time. That experience from the Dutch New Netherland origins was the case in New York City and remained the case and created a mythos that has become one of the contested stories or parts of the stories that we talk about what America's purpose is. Greater Appalachia was discovered by the outside intellectual community, the thought leaders, the writers in the Atlantic Monthly, in the late 19th century, at a time when, for the first time, huge numbers of non-Protestant immigrants were coming into the country during the 1880 to 1924 immigration wave. Protestant America was like, oh my gosh, what will happen? The Catholics will vote how the Pope tells them, the Republic will fall, all kinds of angst going on. And at that moment, some of them discovered in the hollows of Kentucky and West Virginia and elsewhere that there were these people who had been lost. They'd come as early Anglo-Protestant colonizers, had been lost in these valleys, and they're still like an amber speaking Elizabethan English and using technology from that time period and practicing the old-time religion, that these are the untainted real Americans from our founding period that are still there like dinosaur fossils, and that we can tap on that. And we can bring them and work in our factories, and they aren't from the dangerous abroad, they're us, right? And that was kind of imposed on the area, but it became part of the mythos of the area. The entire higher education institutions like Berea College were founded with that extension and outreach. Seminal articles that infected the Americans and how they think about Appalachian, how Appalachian people thought about themselves, that we are the real Americans, like an ethnicity of real Americans, the one place not tainted by foreign corruption like the coasts are. That's a powerful tradition that exists in that region, is sometimes projected elsewhere. The Yankees took the belief, right, the Puritan settlers believed themselves to be a covenanted people like the Old Testament Hebrews, that God had chosen them to go do particular things as a group in the wilderness. So fast forward to the Revolutionary period, and the Yankee intellectuals, who controlled most of the intellectual universities, the thought leadership of the entire country was concentrated in the Yankee zone, and they put forth a story that said, Americans were chosen by God to execute the promises in the Declaration, and that God has chosen us, so therefore we can't fail. The continent is destined to be ours, manifest destiny, a chosen people. God was involved at the founding. All that stuff comes from the Yankee tradition. And these pieces don't quite fit together, but I think you all recognize parts of it. Each one has regional cultural footings, and then they end up out there and inform things like the History War. And the lost cause for the Deep South is more obvious, but those are the battles that take place in our conversations about who we are as a people. And yes, they have regional origins and all of that. On November 4th, you can read about it all in detail.
Back here.
Tony Shivers with the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. From your interview, did you get a sense of responding to civic engagement at the local level and any volunteerism to strengthen their communities?
Those are great questions. We had to be, time is money, and we only have finite money. We had to stay very focused on our core mission. So while we would have liked to have asked questions about what do you do and how you engage, and we didn't ask those sets of questions because we had to devote all of our expensive time and resources to answering the core questions at hand. I think that others do have information on that and concentrate on it, so I think there's decent data out there, but not by us. However, if a philanthropist wants us to go do that work, we're
I'd be happy to do it.
happy to help.
Molly.
Maybe an unfair question a bit, but what strikes me so much looking at just even the digested data that you put up is there is this mass of agreement versus what is relatively an extremist view that right now is quite dominant in our national discourse from all sides. And so it's this, in the work that I do, which is more about how adversarial narratives attack the United States from outside as opposed to inside. But it's this difference between perception and reality that becomes quite important.
Yeah.
Like how do those points of narrative resonate in ways that sort of subvert how we're actually looking at ourselves? And I would be curious if you have thoughts about whether the the reason this very small group of relatively extremist views, when compared to the rest of the United States core
Right.
narrative value, is resonating is this perception both online and in political discourse on the other side of atomization, where you have this perception of increasingly identity-focused politics, which has been a complaint from the right, and I think in many cases a valid complaint. And then online, everybody lives in these tiny atomized universes
Right.
of information where they don't really have access to
Algorithmically curated information
and
bubbles.
you don't really have access to the other stuff unless you're really willing to dig out of the firewall of algorithms. And again, those are sort of three different questions that don't really
Yeah.
jumble together, right? But I would be curious if you had thoughts.
Let me just
The
try to
perception.
let me try to
Summarize
summarize
that
that
for those at home.
for the folks watching on YouTube. But I'm gonna distill it to this: in this current information ecosystem, which is algorithmically driven, why isn't this great not unanimity, but this great majority opinion that you've documented more prevalent and more represented in that information ecosystem?
Right. I mean, first, I totally agree that the broken information environment we live in, which I think started as intentional external actors working on us and using, my background's in Soviet East European studies. I've seen this program before and how information is used in Russia, but we're now doing it to ourselves. And everyone is now, like, the playbook's been learned. You no longer even need an external actor to do it. And the disinformation environment is real. The fact that we started getting siloed first by cable channels and then our social media feeds and then the algorithmic involvement, which can be what you see in the public square. Your public square can be what you're seeing is what somebody hired you to do, to have you see, whether it's to sell widgets or to get you to attack your neighbors or whatever it is. That's the world we live in, and that's really bad. I think that the ethno-national demagogic version has advantages in that it plays solidly to base emotions that work on humans the way we're structured very effectively. It's faster than our rational thinking parts, so there's an advantage there, and it's been very organized and disciplined. There's been no disciplined effort on the civic national side of things to create messaging construction, both because, those concerned about that haven't coordinated or made it a priority for generations. After the Cold War, we stopped talking about that. We talked about it when we were in a Manichaean struggle against the Soviets. Then Soviet communism collapsed, thank goodness. But it wasn't, hey, liberal democracy, small l, small d, defeats despotism. It was capitalism defeats communism, go capitalism. I mean, capitalism is great, but that's not a story of national purpose. And that mistake was made across the Western world, where you assume that all humans are homo economicus, that all we care about is our standard of living. No, people care about their identity and their sense of belonging and their community and culture. People will vote against their self-interest to protect those things, absolutely, because there are things that are really powerful. And essentially, no thinking and just a dropping of that across the Western world or the liberal democratic world, and an increase, an attention and early actors, in my perception, really making use of that information environment. So I guess, you're an expert on that universe. I'm not. I can create the content that I hope that people out there in the world who know how to do these things will do, but we have proof of concept that you can change the opinions of tens of millions of people and move them to believe almost anything. QAnon, you should inject yourself with horse dewormers to fight COVID. I mean, almost anything you can shift lots of people to do. It works. I don't live in that world, but I believe that therefore it should be possible to move people towards what is a compelling narrative that they actually, when they stop and think about, believe in. That's something that you ought to be able to work with in the information spaces that I myself don't operate in, but I believe it must be possible to do the same.
We'll go here, and then we'll go here. I think we got a couple over here and back there. So, her,
Great.
sir.
Great to see you again. I think you guys set that up for the book company. But
Thanks, Zach.
starting with the question very, very clearly, I mean, are we bound to just repeat these patterns over and over again? You talked a little bit about Woodrow Wilson and some of the themes that occurred there repeating themselves now, the breakthroughs in the 60s. A lot of friends are surprised that we're where we are right now, that people are willing to give up certain rights in order to entertain or to speak to some of the concerns that they had. And I don't want to limit this to ethnic group or geography, but even though the numbers that you showed in your poll, we still were able to see the views of more extremist approaches, I think demonstrated in the current president, prevail. So are we just bound to just go back and forth between different Americans in perpetuity, or is there a way to sort of have those themes that you talked about, that common narrative, prevail and find some sort of normalcy? We're starting to talk now about the 90s as being the golden age. Right? So, because there was stability, I'm sure there were problems. It was post-Cold War.
There was hope.
There was hope, exactly. And then Barack Obama gets elected. A lot of people, again, hope, and other people see backlash. So how is it that we are, if you could glean going forward, right? How is it that we're going to stabilize again? How is it that we can sort of come around to that narrative that you talked about? Or are we just bound to just go back and forth, between these two views of America?
So for the folks at home, right?
Simplify that.
Yeah, are we caught in a forever loop of these different competing narratives in American history?
Right, and this is really a human condition question. I mean, my take on it is that you have to constantly fight for a free society to exist, right? A liberal democratic society, small l, small d, is that individuals can be as free as is possible that can be sustainable intergenerationally over time. Otherwise, you end up with an aristocracy. And doing that, keeping the eye on the ball between maximizing individual liberty before you get to the point where it's a matter of birthright, not merit or anything else, that the promise exists of having an equal opportunity to be meaningfully free and to pursue your happiness, that's a tricky thing that is constantly dynamic and in motion. It means you've got to fight and be on the ball as a people in a society all the time to keep that. Because the universe wants entropy. Human history, for most of the 5,000 years that we've had advanced human civilizations, has been despotisms. Right? The idea that individuals should be free wasn't even a concept anyone thought of until 400 years ago, and we're still not very good at doing it. It's a complicated thing. You got to have, there's nothing normal and given about it. It's a good thing, but we have to constantly be fighting and paying attention to it because human nature and everything else wants to pull us down into a everyone against everyone Hobbesian kind of environment. And so, yeah, we're destined to always need to be committed to the fight, but I don't think we're destined to fall into the cycles. I mean, Woodrow Wilson was the first time that across the entire Federation that ethno-national model and essentially repudiation of the Declaration's values captured the entire Federation. It was contested constantly until that moment, and then it wasn't until the 1960s, for the first time, that there was a consensus across the Federation that the civic national model and the Declaration were what we were about, right? Other times it was contested. So those were watershed moments in our history, both of them, not just repetitions, but now we're in another, inflection point in our history.
Eternal vigilance is the price of liberty. We've got 5 minutes left, so let's get a couple of these questions, and we'll just get through as many as we can. Bernie, did you have one?
Yeah. First of all, it's good to see you again, both of you. But let me ask the pragmatic question. We have this titanic struggle between the far left and the far right in the United States, polarization. And both sides of the belief that they are 100% right. The place, which I believe, but many scholars and political scientists are of the view, that things get done is between center-left and center-right, finding accommodation, finding compromise, finding negotiation, and then we move forward, sometimes in fits and starts, but that most of that is happening there as opposed usually to the extremes. But the center-right to center-left, again, a lot of consensus thinking, have lost the thread of how to express it to the American people and connect with them. Bill Clinton pursued that with the DLC to try to come up with a new message, a new formulation that connected with people. Eisenhower, the Ripon Society, there's
Yeah.
a whole history there. How do we take the findings and interpretations of your work and somehow get it up into the center-left and center-right think tanks, institutes, and
Right.
others to help both what I'll call Eisenhower, Bush Republicans,
Sure.
and Kennedy, Carter, Clinton Democrats figure out how to communicate with the American people again. How, because right now, both center-right and center-left, it's as though the TV's been turned off.
So
Yeah.
for the folks at home, the question is basically, how do you take your findings and get it into the zeitgeist?
Right. And I agree that those are the components. We live in a world where the center is weakened, so the power of the conventional center-left and center-right to broker the deals, I think that is shifting. I talk about there is a coalition that goes from Liz Cheney to Liz Warren, right? It's a big coalition, and it's a pro-liberal Democratic one. I think when you're speaking about the civic narrative versus an ethno-national one, it's like there's a middle 70, 75%. There's 20% on the far right wing, and there's 5% on the far left wing that everyone, a bunch of college campuses, but it's pretty small. But concentrating on that big middle, and the conventional, Burkean right, and center-left DLC kind of thing are an important nexus in the middle of it. But I think you can take in a much wider swath than that of people who are committed to the American experiment. If you're committed to that, we're on board for this. So that's my theory of the case. I do, though, how do you get to people? We are conversing and interacting all the time with anybody who cares about this stuff, but I've been invited out and speak at AEI and written for them, and ditto for Milk and Global Conference, and people at Brookings and people at New America, and all of those outfits, because I think that the think tanks and thought leadership matter, but also press and op-eds and other people and organizations, all of the above. And anybody who's interested in this and wants to interface, we give this out. It's a public library shelf, but I'm happy to talk to anybody who wants to defend the American experiment, regardless of where they sit. And if anyone in this room or out in the audience is one of those people or know people, drop us an email. I'll be there to talk this stuff immediately and share whatever we can that is helpful.
Sir.
In the minute or so we have left.
Yeah.
I hope your insight and what I think is one of the most material disruptions of the post-1960s national narrative. And that is the evolution of the idea of equality of opportunity, which is the Martin Luther King, what most Americans got out of the speech in the mall, judged by the content of your character, not the color of your skin, to one of equality of outcome, as the Republicans would say, or equity, as the Democrats would say. And I think you're seeing that as I see that as a major driver. I've seen it in polling as a major driver.
Yeah.
The way that various identity groups voted in the last election. And obviously you're seeing a major retrenchment from the current administration on this. How does that fit into your model at all, how that evolved, and what that means for a shared narrative?
So the question would be, how does the evolution of the narrative around equality of opportunity to equality of outcome fit into your findings at Nationhood Lab?
So in the Declaration's values terms, if we lived in an optimal, perfect society, if history began today, then obviously it's about equality of opportunity. But if you violated the Declaration's propositions for centuries by having a slave system and redlining and all of those other things, we're not starting at year zero. And what do you do about that? And that ends up being the battle over the equality argument. If you violated the Declaration's promises and condemned people because of the color of their skin, not their character, or whatever it is, the society has failed the ideals. Then what do you do about it? Do you just say it's year zero, go for it? Or do you affirmative action and amends to try to fix the fact you violated? Those affirmative action, those things technically violate the spirit of the Declaration, but it's not day one, right? We violated it before. So the whole conversation is about that, and where people's commitment to the civic ideals of the country fall in is whether they want to say it's year zero, the past doesn't matter, or they say we violated those things in the past, therefore we have to do X and Y as a back fix to reset it. That's a legitimate political conversation, but that, to me, is how it falls into this paradigm, is what time horizons are you talking about? Was there a past, or are we starting right now? And then what should you do? Because, yeah, if you're treating different people differently, that's not the natural rights, equality of opportunity. But if you've had affirmative action for white people for 2 centuries, that's a thing too that you can't pretend didn't happen.
We got time for one more question.
I get the last one. So, congratulations on the launch of the project.
Thank you.
Super interesting. I wanted to ask you about the word democracy and where it fits into this narrative frame, because reading through this quickly, it's kind of conspicuous in its absence. And I'm really struck that in the last election cycle, democracy was on the ballot. Joe Biden, when he was the candidate for the Democrats, tried to make the election a referendum on democracy. And then, really interesting, in the exit polling, democracy was one of the top issues among Republicans, including self-identified MAGA Republicans. So democracy, clearly it gets the juices going for many Americans, but why didn't you include it? I'm sure that the research gave
What does democracy mean? Well, so the broad intellectual answer to why is democracy do you not see it as much in the narrative is the promise in the Declaration, our opening statement as a people as to what our purpose is to secure those natural rights ideals. How you do that is a secondary operational plan. Democracy is a way to achieve those ideals. Theoretically, it might not be the only way. I think it happens to be the way that works in our context, but the ideals and the mission transcend even the conversation about democracy or what the Constitution is a business plan to execute the mission statement. It's a compromise business plan created at a time when they were trying to keep a slave-holding caste system of oligarchs and their colonies in the Federation. So there's all kinds of weird compromises in there. We've been having to do back fixes ever since, including the post-Civil War amendments, which align the Constitution to be somewhere close to the Declaration, whereas before it wasn't, right? Those are 2 very different things. And the other thing I would say is this democracy alone, you hear me say liberal democracy, small l, small d, because it's the protection of individual rights against the tyranny of the majority is essential to the Declaration's promises. You can have illiberal democracies. Putin, could probably win an election that was free and fair. Viktor Orban came to power. He's wildly popular, right? He's creating an authoritarian state, but you can have authoritarian democracies too. So it's hard in a general context, as democracies are shorthand, but democracy by itself only gets you part of the way towards the Declaration. And that's why it's also important now that the word democracy is becoming partisan politicized, which is kind of horrifying. But the fact that the Declaration even transcends that conversation, I think is helpful to the entire project of our common purpose.
Ladies and gentlemen, the data that Colin has worked on is all available at nationhoodlab.org. You can also get a link from pellcenter.org. I thank all of you for coming, and I thank Colin Woodward for his great work.
Thank you. Thank you for coming.
There's coffee, stay.